It was supposed to be just another ordinary morning. April 17th, 1980, dawned quiet and calm in the small town of Keller, Texas. The air was crisp, the sun barely rising above the rooftops, casting golden light over a cluster of suburban homes nestled along a cul-de-sac known to locals as Willow Creek Lane. Back then, Keller was more farmland than city, where neighbors knew each other by name and front doors were often left unlocked. It was the kind of town where kids played outside until the porch lights flickered on and families gathered around the dinner table every night. That morning, 7 kids, 3 boys and 4 girls, left their homes to walk to school. They were part of the same tight-knit neighborhood, a little tribe of childhood friends who rode bikes together in summer, built forts in the woods, and walked to school side by side every morning. The group included 12-year-old Joshua Burns, a baseball lover with a scraped-up glove always dangling from his backpack. His best friend, David Moreno, age 10, was a quiet kid who loved sketching. Madison and Mallory King, identical 9-year-old twins with a reputation for finishing each other's sentences, trailed just behind with Mia Harper, a bubbly 6-year-old who insisted on wearing the same pink sweater every day. Rounding out the group were Ethan Wells, the youngest at 6, and 13-year-old Erica Hall, who often took on a big sister role to the rest of the kids. She was the one who reminded them to look both ways, to stay out of the muddy ditch along the path, and to never talk to strangers. They left around 7:45 a.m., just like they always did. The walk to Keller Elementary took them about 10 minutes, down Willow Creek Lane, across a narrow footbridge, and through a wooded shortcut that the kids lovingly called the Hollow. It was a place filled with laughter and worn dirt trails, tree carvings with their initials, and secrets only kids knew. But on this particular morning, something happened, and the 7 kids were never seen again. By 9 a.m., their teachers noticed the empty desks but assumed the group was running late. Maybe the bridge was blocked. Maybe they stopped to play. Or someone had gotten sick. A call was made to one of the houses around lunchtime, just to check in. That's when the panic set in. One by one, the parents were contacted. None of them had seen the children since they left that morning. None had received a phone call from the school, or heard from any of the other parents. Within an hour, the local police were involved. A search party was formed, and dozens of community members began walking the route between the homes and the school. The woods were combed, ditches checked, backyards opened. It was as though the 7 had been erased from existence in broad daylight. By sundown, the quiet town had transformed into a scene from a nightmare. Helicopters flew overhead with spotlights sweeping through fields. Volunteers shouted the children's names as they pushed deeper into the brush. The sound of dogs barking echoed into the night as search teams huddled around camp lanterns and police radios squawked with urgency. But there was nothing. No backpack dropped in the mud. No footprint that strayed from the path. No item of clothing snagged on a branch. It was like the trail had ended before it ever began. Word spread fast, first across the county, then the state. News trucks arrived with satellite dishes, broadcasting live from the school's front lawn. Reporters asked questions no one could answer. Were they taken? Did they run away? Was this a prank gone horribly wrong? The families of the missing children were consumed with fear. Mothers sat outside on porches wrapped in blankets, eyes red from crying. Fathers walked the hollow again and again, calling names that were never answered. The community, once so sure of itself, now felt unsafe. Kids were pulled from school. Doors were locked. Curfews were enforced. And still, there was no trace. Local law enforcement quickly handed the case to the FBI. Profiles were created. Tips poured in. Strangers spotted with children in the next town over. Strange vans parked in nearby neighborhoods. Suspicious men seen walking along the highway. But every lead turned into a dead end. The man in the van was a traveling salesman. The strangers at the diner were just a large family on vacation. No evidence, no bodies, no witnesses. The school, once filled with laughter, now echoed with silence. Classrooms had 7 more empty desks. Their absence hung heavy, like a fog no one could see through. Some teachers couldn't bear to teach in those rooms anymore. Some of the students refused to come back at all. Weeks passed, then months. The posters faded. The reporters moved on. The case grew colder by the day. And yet, every parent held onto hope in their own way. Some left the porch lights on at night, hoping their child would come walking back. Others kept bedrooms untouched, beds still made, toys still scattered. On birthdays, they lit candles and whispered prayers. And on every April 17th, the families gathered together at the edge of the hollow to hold hands, light lanterns, and say the names of the 7 kids whose laughter once echoed through the trees. It was a wound the town could never heal from, a mystery that dug deep roots into the hearts of everyone who remembered that day. A story told in hushed voices at sleepovers, a warning passed from one generation to the next. And yet, all these years later, one fact remained unchanged. The 7 children of Willow Creek Lane had vanished without a trace. The 7 kids, Joshua, Erica, the twins Madison and Mallory, David, Mia, and little Ethan, weren't just names on a missing persons report. In Keller, Texas, they were a living part of the town's heartbeat. You couldn't walk past Willow Creek Lane without hearing their laughter, seeing their chalk drawings on sidewalks, or spotting their bikes leaned against each other like trusted friends resting between adventures. They were always together, friendly, kind, and inseparable. Some called them the Magnificent Seven. Others simply called them family, even if they weren't related by blood. When they vanished, it wasn't just 7 children gone. It was as if someone had taken the town's spirit and torn it out without warning. Word of their disappearance traveled fast. Within hours, local authorities set up checkpoints on every road leading in and out of Keller. They flagged every unfamiliar vehicle. Gas stations were questioned, buses inspected, travelers asked for ID. Deputies went door to door in a radius that expanded by the hour, asking residents if they'd seen or heard anything unusual, anything strange. But the answers were always the same. Nothing. The area around the kids' walking route was sealed off. Police tape fluttered in the breeze across the hollow trail, and search dogs sniffed through brush and ditches, but found no scent trail beyond the first few hundred feet from where the children were last seen. Within a day, the Keller Police Department brought in state investigators. By day 3, the FBI had arrived. They set up a mobile operations unit in the elementary school parking lot, brought in criminal profilers, and combed through every bit of family history, neighbor reports, and school records. Every adult in the neighborhood was questioned. Everyone who had driven through town that morning was pulled into interviews. But there were no signs of a struggle. No broken branches, no dropped lunchboxes, no torn clothing, no screams had been heard. No one saw a van or a stranger or a shadow slipping between trees. It was as if they had simply dissolved into the air. This lack of evidence only deepened the mystery. The absence of noise was its own kind of horror. If someone had taken them, surely someone would have seen something. 7 children couldn't just vanish silently in the middle of a weekday morning. And yet they had. Theories spread like wildfire. Some believed the kids had been abducted by someone they knew, someone they trusted enough to follow off the trail. Maybe it was a neighbor, a family friend, a substitute teacher. The thought chilled parents to their core, because if it was someone familiar, it meant the danger had been close all along. Others feared something darker. Maybe they had stumbled upon something, or someone they weren't supposed to. A crime scene in the woods, a secret meeting, an old structure hiding something it shouldn't. One whisper claimed the kids had found something buried out there, and whoever was responsible couldn't let them leave. Another theory suggested they were taken not by one person, but a group, organized, efficient, and prepared. One of the more disturbing rumors came from a pair of teenagers who claimed to have been walking near the hollow the same morning. They said they heard rustling in the trees, a loud car engine revving, and then sudden silence. Police interviewed them thoroughly, but found no physical trace to back up their story. The media descended quickly. Camera crews lined up outside the children's homes, interviewing tearful parents and overwhelmed officers. The town, which had barely seen crime beyond the occasional stolen bike or argument between neighbors, became the focus of the nation's attention. People mailed in tips from across the country. Some claimed psychic visions. Others pointed fingers at cult activity, kidnappers, or hidden tunnels beneath the woods. But every single lead led nowhere. In truth, there was nothing to build a case on. No footprints beyond the normal trail marks. No tire tracks that couldn't be accounted for. No broken fence, torn backpack, or suspicious substance. It was as if the children had simply taken a turn on that trail and stepped out of reality itself. And that, more than anything, tore the town apart. The hollow, once a place of innocence and imagination, became a place of dread. Parents forbade their children from going near it. The trees seemed darker now, their branches more twisted. Even the birds seemed to avoid the area. The children's families were placed under intense scrutiny, not because of suspicion, but because the FBI was grasping for anything. Any hint of dysfunction, any unknown uncle or distant cousin who might have held a grudge. But nothing surfaced. These weren't families in conflict. These were ordinary people living ordinary lives in a town where something unthinkable had just occurred. Some residents began to grow suspicious of each other. Whispered accusations spread at grocery stores and churches. Trust eroded. Fear festered. And through it all, the evidence remained unchanged. Zero. It had only been hours since the children had left their homes. Then days. Then weeks. And still, not one sign. Not one sound. Not one clue. By summer, the posters had been replaced with fading yellow ribbons. The search parties dwindled. Helicopters stopped flying overhead. The reward money, donated by churches, local businesses, even strangers, remained unclaimed. Eventually, the media left. The story, unable to offer new details, lost momentum. News anchors moved on to newer tragedies. And Keller, a town that had never asked to be famous, was left in silence once more. The 7 children of Willow Creek Lane were officially classified as a mass disappearance with no known cause. A cold case, a phantom tragedy. But for the people who had known them, the ones who had watched them grow up, seen their drawings on sidewalks, and heard their footsteps in driveways, they weren't cold. They weren't gone. They were missing. And they were missed. The first few weeks after the disappearance of the 7 Keller children were nothing short of chaos. What had started as a localized emergency quickly escalated into one of the most intense missing persons investigations the region had ever seen. Search efforts, media presence, and public hysteria collided in a town unprepared for the storm it found itself in. Flyers with the kids' photos, sunny school portraits, snapshots from birthdays and sports days were posted on every telephone pole, gas station window, and community bulletin board from Denton County to Dallas. Volunteers walked the streets daily, handing out leaflets to strangers, posting updates on store doors, and asking the same gut-wrenching question. Have you seen them? Tips flooded in from all directions. One of the earliest came from a delivery driver who claimed he saw a light blue van speeding away from the hollow trail around the time the children would have been walking through it. He remembered it because it looked out of place, rusted, dented, no windows in the back. The van had temporary license plates, which he couldn't read in time. Investigators leapt on the tip. Roadblocks were set up along every highway exit. Officers visited mechanics and auto shops in neighboring towns, hoping someone had worked on such a vehicle. But after an exhaustive effort, the lead went cold. No blue van was ever located. No surveillance footage captured it. No witness ever confirmed it again. Another tip pointed to a drifter who had been spotted near the woods just days before the children vanished. Described as scruffy, sunburned, and carrying a backpack, he had been seen loitering behind a closed diner near the town's edge. When police released a composite sketch based on vague descriptions, several locals thought they recognized him from out-of-town parks or the train station. But by the time officers canvassed those areas, he was gone. Whether he had moved on or vanished in his own way, no one knew. One neighbor came forward to report that a man she didn't recognize had knocked on her door 3 days before the disappearance. He claimed to be selling magazines for a school fundraiser, but he was alone. No ID, no catalog, no official papers. She had slammed the door on him after he started asking personal questions about her kids. Police worked with the woman to create a sketch, and a few towns over, someone believed they had seen the same man near an elementary school. But again, nothing came of it. No arrests were made. No evidence connected any of these sightings to the missing children. With no leads producing results, the community began to shift into desperation. The town's police force, overwhelmed and understaffed, reached out to every available resource. Texas Rangers were brought in. Behavioral analysts from the FBI tried to build a profile of what kind of person, or people, could have orchestrated such a disappearance. But the problem was always the same. Nothing had been left behind. Not a shoe, not a crumpled backpack, not a single fingerprint that didn't belong to one of the residents already on record. With no forensic trail to follow, authorities were left chasing shadows. As days turned to weeks, hope became harder to hold on to. Families of the missing children turned to increasingly unorthodox methods. Some brought in private investigators, hoping that a fresh set of eyes might see what others had missed. Others turned to psychics, men and women claiming to sense the presence of the missing, to communicate with the lost, or to visualize scenes from the past. These sessions were often emotional, even gutting. Some parents emerged shaken, others strangely hopeful, though none gained closure. One psychic from New Mexico claimed she saw water, a river, or maybe a lake. She insisted the children were trapped somewhere underground near running water. Police investigated the old drainage tunnels near the hollow. They brought in divers to examine small local ponds and even drained one of them completely. But again, nothing. A well-known medium flew in from Louisiana and held a town hall session. Hundreds attended. She claimed the kids were still nearby and hadn't crossed over. Her presence sparked both ridicule and a sliver of renewed attention. But ultimately, she offered no direction that led to real answers. The media, which had covered the story relentlessly for the first month, began to move on. At first, there were daily reports, then weekly updates. Eventually, the story faded from the national spotlight, leaving only a few articles in regional papers and the occasional special segment on local television. The bright camera lights disappeared, news vans left town, and the silence that replaced them felt louder than anything before. The families, meanwhile, lived as though time had stopped. Bedrooms were left untouched. Clothes remained in drawers. One mother, Ethan's, baked cupcakes every birthday, 7 candles, always blue, and left them at the edge of the trail just in case. Another father, Madison and Mallory's, kept his front porch light on every night for years. It became a symbol in the neighborhood, a quiet declaration. They're not forgotten. In town, conversations changed. People grew quieter when certain names were mentioned. The hollow became a place no one walked through anymore. Newcomers to Keller sometimes asked why the wooded path was fenced off or why so many people in one neighborhood had moved away in the early 1980s. Longtime residents would just shake their heads and change the subject, though the posters were eventually taken down. Worn by rain and wind, the pain never left. For the families, those faces were seared into their memory. For the town, it was a wound that never scabbed over. By the end of that first year, no new evidence had come forward. The FBI returned to their regional offices. The leads were boxed up and stored. The case officially went cold. But in Keller, in the hearts of every parent who ever waved their child off to school and watched them disappear down the sidewalk, the fear stayed alive. Every anniversary brought it back. Each April, the town remembered in its own quiet way. A candle left by the trail, a bouquet placed under the school sign, a prayer whispered by someone who hadn't forgotten. Because even when the rest of the world moved on, Keller never did. Decades had passed. The case of the missing children from Keller, Texas had grown cold long ago, like frost settling over memories too painful to touch. By 2019, most of the original investigators had retired. The community had changed. New families had moved in, unaware of the weight the town still carried. The hollow trail was long overgrown. The school had been remodeled, and only a few faded photos remained in the local library archives. 7 innocent faces staring out from a time that had quietly slipped into legend. But time has a strange way of revealing what people think is forever buried. On a late autumn morning in 2019, a real estate developer from Fort Worth purchased a 12-acre plot on the outskirts of Keller. It was once a working ranch, but had been left untouched for nearly 30 years. The land had gone wild, tall grass thick with burrs, brush wrapped around rusting equipment, and in the center of the property stood an old barn, partially collapsed. The structure sagged under its own weight, a broken skeleton of red-painted wood and rusted metal sheets. Its roof caved in, doors hanging from twisted hinges. The developer had plans to clear the area for new luxury homes. The site was ideal, quiet, private, and surrounded by dense trees. He saw potential. His crew saw problems. The first few days of demolition were routine. Bulldozers pushed down fencing. Trees were marked. Surveyors scanned the land. But when workers began dismantling what remained of the barn, one of them noticed something strange. Near the barn's foundation, where a section of the exterior had rotted away, there was a narrow wooden panel nailed tightly into the frame. Not part of the original structure. The nails were newer, shinier, oddly out of place compared to the rest of the building. Curious, one of the workers pried it open. Behind it, wedged into a shallow gap in the wall cavity, was a small, rusted lunchbox. It was the old-fashioned kind, a dome top, worn handle, red paint flaking off in strips. It was sealed with a brittle rubber strap that cracked when they tried to open it. The foreman called the site manager, thinking it might just be an old keepsake left behind by a ranch hand. A quirky find, something to post on social media before tossing it away. But when they opened the box, the entire site went silent. Inside were 7 handmade friendship bracelets. Each one was slightly different in color and stitching, but all were crafted from similar woven thread. Some had small beads, others tiny plastic charms. But what made their blood run cold were the names sewn into each bracelet. Tiny, careful letters, stitched in with deliberate hands. Joshua, Eric, Madison, Mallory, David, Mia, Ethan. No one on that crew had grown up in Keller, but the site manager had. He froze as soon as he read the names. 7 names, 7 children, all vanished on the same morning in 1980. His voice cracked as he called the police. "You're going to want to come see this for yourself," he told them. "It's about the kids, the ones who went missing." The Keller Police Department responded within the hour. A crime scene team arrived, followed shortly after by a detective from the cold case unit. The lunchbox was removed with extreme care and placed into evidence. The area around the barn was taped off, and work on the site halted immediately. It didn't take long for word to spread. Local reporters dug out the old headlines. The story made regional news within a day, then national news by the weekend. People across the country were captivated. Had the mystery finally cracked open? Could a rusted lunchbox offer the answer to a 39-year-old question that had haunted so many for so long? The bracelets were examined one by one. Forensic specialists confirmed the thread types and materials were consistent with the late 1970s. Microscopic traces of skin cells, long dormant, were found woven into the fibers. Though damaged by time and elements, they were enough to begin DNA analysis. But what startled investigators even more was what they found beneath the bracelets. Folded underneath them, pressed flat from years of storage, was a torn corner of notebook paper. On it, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were 3 words: "They saw me." There was no signature, no explanation, just a sentence that felt like a confession. Detectives immediately began researching the barn's history. Public records showed that the ranch had changed hands several times over the decades, most recently falling into foreclosure in the early 1990s. But between 1978 and 1981, it had been owned by a man named Ellis Boone, a former handyman, rarely seen in town, known for living alone and keeping to himself. He had no close family, no known employment, no digital footprint after 1981. According to property tax records, Boone stopped paying taxes on the ranch in late 1981 and disappeared shortly afterward. His name had never surfaced in the original investigation, possibly because he lived on the outskirts and had no criminal history. At the time, the property hadn't even been fully searched. Its remoteness and unclear ownership had placed it low on the priority list. That changed now. Investigators brought in ground-penetrating radar to scan the land surrounding the barn. Forensic teams began digging through the barn's foundation. Every scrap of wood, every brick, every beam was documented. They were no longer demolishing the land. They were excavating a crime scene. The discovery of the bracelets reignited the town's memory, like gasoline poured on glowing embers. The families, some still living in Keller, others long gone, returned to offer DNA samples, speak to investigators, and attend candlelight vigils outside the property. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, hope and heartbreak walked hand in hand again. The friendship bracelets weren't just childhood crafts. They were proof the children had been at that barn, that they hadn't wandered off, that they hadn't run away. Someone had taken them. Someone had kept them there, at least long enough for these tokens to be created or confiscated and hidden away. And someone had left a message. "They saw me." That simple line changed everything. The barn wasn't just old wood and rusted nails anymore. It was a doorway, one that had stayed closed for far too long. While investigators examined the rusted lunchbox and the delicate bracelets within, they continued combing the old barn for additional evidence. The entire structure had been declared a forensic site now, no longer just a rotting piece of history, but the possible epicenter of one of Texas's longest-running child disappearance mysteries. Every floorboard was lifted, every beam inspected, and it wasn't long before they found something else. Hidden beneath the warped floorboards near the far corner of the barn, beneath layers of hay, dirt, and insect-infested boards, they discovered a bundle wrapped in crumbling plastic. At first, it looked like little more than a decayed logbook or field journal, warped from decades of moisture and neglect. But as the crime scene technician carefully peeled away the outer layers, they realized what they were holding: a personal journal. The cover was a faded navy blue, cracked down the spine, the edges chewed by rodents or time, or both. Pages stuck together like soggy papier-mâché. And yet, somehow inside, many of the entries were still legible. Ink had bled and smudged, but certain sections remained intact, frozen like disturbing time capsules. The name inside the front cover was written in sharp, blocky handwriting: Ellis M. Boone. Investigators immediately began reviewing the contents while forensic archivists worked to dry and preserve each page. The first few entries seemed mundane. Notes about the weather, brief observations about the animals on the ranch, comments about needing to replace tools or fix part of the roof. But as they flipped deeper into the journal, the tone began to change. The handwriting became looser, more erratic. Sentences trailed off, sometimes turning into scribbles. Words repeated. Themes of isolation and fear appeared. The entries turned darker. Disturbing. One page contained only the phrase, "They see too much," written over and over again. The pressure of the pen increasing until the words tore through the paper. And then came the entry that chilled even the most seasoned detectives. "They saw me. I couldn't let them leave. They were just kids. I didn't want to hurt them. But the silence is safer." The room reportedly fell silent as the team read those words aloud. It wasn't just the content. It was the rawness of it. The mixture of fear, guilt, and detachment. The kind of confession that isn't given to a priest or a person, but to a page. To something that won't judge you, only hold your secrets. This was no longer speculation. Someone had acknowledged the children. Someone had seen them. And according to that entry, someone had made the decision to keep them from leaving. The name Ellis Boone was immediately run through every database available. Old census records, property deeds, military service databases. But they found very little. What they did uncover painted a picture of a man who lived on the margins of society. Boone had been employed briefly in the mid-1970s as a ranch caretaker and general handyman for the property where the barn stood. Records showed that he had received modest paychecks from the landowner at the time, and then nothing. After 1981, there was no paper trail, no tax returns, no employment history, no hospital records, no official death certificate. Boone had simply vanished. Police realized something even more startling. His name had never come up in the original investigation into the children's disappearance. His connection to the property was never established. At the time, the barn hadn't even been thoroughly searched, perhaps because the land was on the outskirts, or maybe because Boone's presence had faded into the background before the case reached its peak. Neighbors interviewed in the days following the journal's discovery gave fragmented recollections. Some remembered a quiet man who kept to himself, rarely making eye contact. A few recalled hearing hammering or movement late at night from the direction of the barn, but assumed it was animals or just Boone fixing something. No one remembered seeing children with him. No one thought to report anything at the time. Boone, as it turned out, was the kind of man who could disappear without anyone noticing. Not because he was invisible, but because he lived just far enough outside the line of attention to remain forgotten. Investigators began digging deeper, trying to trace where Boone might have gone after 1981. There were unconfirmed sightings over the years. An anonymous man living in the woods near Wichita Falls in the late 90s, someone fitting his description who passed through a truck stop near Amarillo in 2003, but nothing ever verified. He had become a ghost, a name with no address, a face that existed only in blurred memory. The journal also hinted at Boone's deteriorating mental state. Some entries were deeply paranoid. He wrote of people listening through the trees and eyes on the ridge. He mentioned the barn knowing things, and referred to the children not by name, but sometimes as the noise or the brightness. There were sections that read like hallucinations, others like regret. The final entry was short, a single line written in shaky, almost childlike letters. "They are still here." Whether he meant that literally or metaphorically, No one could be sure, but the words added another layer of unease. It was clear Boone had not been well, but he had been real, and very likely, he had been the last person to see those 7 children alive. The discovery reignited national interest in the Keller case. News anchors who had once covered the story returned to report updates. Podcasts and true crime documentaries scrambled to reconstruct Boone's timeline. The FBI reopened files that had gathered dust for decades, and the people of Keller, they began to remember. What had once been a hole in the town's history was now taking shape. There was a name, a place, a confession, and though the path forward remained uncertain, one thing was becoming clear. The silence that had haunted this story for so long was beginning to speak. With Ellis Boone's disturbing journal in hand, and the memory of those handmade friendship bracelets still fresh in their minds, investigators intensified their efforts. The barn had already revealed decades-old secrets, but the most pressing questions still loomed. Where were the children? They needed more than words scribbled in a journal. They needed proof. They needed to bring the children home. A team from the Texas Rangers, working alongside forensic specialists, brought in ground-penetrating radar, GPR, a tool capable of detecting irregularities beneath the Earth's surface. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. The area behind the barn had grown wild with time. Thickets of cedar trees, some now towering over 20 feet tall, cast long shadows over the property. Dead branches, fallen leaves, and years of overgrowth covered the ground like a forgotten blanket. Most people would have walked past it without thinking twice. But when the GPR crew scanned the section near the southern fence line, an area hidden beneath a dense tangle of cedar roots, they noticed something. A rectangular pattern repeated 7 times. Uniform, slightly disturbed. No modern construction debris. No metal. Just voids in the earth where solid, undisturbed ground should have been. The radar technician marked the locations quietly. No one said it out loud, but everyone on that team knew what they had found. The energy shifted. Conversations dropped to whispers. One of the younger agents reportedly excused himself to cry in private. Excavation began the next morning. The first few inches of soil offered nothing unusual, just compacted dirt and dry leaves. But 6 inches in, the color of the soil changed. It darkened, softened. A heavy silence fell as the team dug further. And then they found the first bone. The work stopped. Photographs were taken. Grid patterns were laid out. Each site became a delicate operation, carefully uncovering layer after layer of the past. By the end of the day, the truth that Keller had feared for 39 long years was no longer a mystery. 7 shallow graves, each one less than 2 feet deep, each arranged in a line, though uneven, hastily done, perhaps under pressure or fear. The spacing suggested the burials had occurred quickly, without ceremony. Not a cold, calculated plan, but a desperate attempt to hide something unthinkable. Personal items were found in the graves, little details that brought unimaginable weight to the discovery. Joshua's plastic toy truck, faded yellow and missing one wheel, was tucked near his ribcage. Mia's pink backpack, still containing 2 crayons and a folded spelling test marked with a star, was buried beside her. Ethan's superhero lunch tin was crushed under the weight of soil, but still bore the image of his favorite comic book character, barely visible through rust and grime. Each grave held echoes of childhood: a hair ribbon, a sneaker, a friendship bracelet that matched those found in the lunchbox. Forensic anthropologists worked carefully to preserve and catalog the remains. DNA samples were taken and run against the genetic material already submitted by surviving family members. The matches came in one by one, confirming what the town had long suspected but never dared to say aloud. The children had never left Keller. They hadn't been taken across state lines. They hadn't been trafficked or sold, or spirited away to some distant place. They had died here, together, likely on the very day they vanished, April 17th, 1980. It was a revelation that sent shockwaves through the entire community. The Keller police chief held a press conference, his voice trembling as he confirmed the identities. Parents who had once held out hope now fell into grief all over again. The pain that had been frozen in time for nearly 4 decades thawed into something sharp and fresh. But even with the remains discovered, some questions still lingered. The cause of death could not be determined. The remains were too degraded to identify exact trauma. There were no gunshot wounds, no broken skulls, no visible signs of struggle. But some forensic clues hinted at a slow and cruel fate. The way the bodies were positioned, arms folded across chests, curled into themselves, suggested they had not been buried immediately. Experts speculated that the children may have been kept alive for days, perhaps locked in the barn, perhaps starved, perhaps too scared to cry out. It was a possibility that horrified investigators, not just the act itself, but the thought that they may have suffered in silence, less than a mile from their own homes. Search dogs were brought in to sweep the barn again, this time trained specifically to detect blood and human scent residue. Faint traces were found in one of the deeper storage pits under the floorboards, supporting the theory that the barn had served as a temporary holding space. The evidence, when combined, told a chilling story, one that aligned almost perfectly with the words in Ellis Boone's journal. "They saw me. I couldn't let them leave." Boone had written it as if justifying something, as if fear had driven him to commit an act he couldn't undo. And once it was done, he ran. Boone was never found. His name was never tied to a bank account. He was never arrested. There was no death certificate, no known family. It was like he had stepped into the woods and become part of them. A phantom, a name attached to a nightmare. After the discovery, the property was placed under protection. The graves were carefully exhumed and transferred to the local coroner's office for final autopsies. A memorial was planned, 7 white crosses, each marked with the names of the children and the date they were found. Keller held a vigil that lasted all night. Hundreds of residents, many too young to remember 1980, stood side by side in silence. Some brought candles, others held framed photographs. A few brought toys and placed them near the edge of the field, where the cedar trees whispered quietly in the wind. It had taken nearly 4 decades, but the children had finally come home. The hollow was no longer just a trail. The barn was no longer just a ruin. The land had finally given up its secrets, and the silence that had haunted the town for so long had spoken its last word. News of the discovery swept across the country like wildfire. It began with a local news station's somber report at 6 p.m. A brief mention of remains linked to a decades-old case unearthed near Keller, Texas. But within hours, larger networks picked it up. By midnight, the story had gone national. By morning, it was on every front page, every feed, every true crime forum. The names of the 7 children, long whispered in Texas as part of a tragic mystery, were now known nationwide. Joshua, Erica, Madison, Mallory, David, Mia, Ethan. They were no longer just names on faded posters or memories locked inside aging family albums. They had become real again. Faces, souls, children whose stories were stolen, and now, finally, told. Families who had lived under the weight of silence for 39 years returned to the town that had never left them. Many had moved away after the disappearances, unable to live with the daily reminders. But this moment, this terrible, sacred moment, called them back, not to mourn what was lost, but to finally acknowledge it, to see it, to give it the honor it always deserved. They gathered at the edge of the property, now cordoned off with caution tape and dotted with crime scene flags. But behind that yellow line, something softer had begun. Volunteers from town had cleared a path through the trees. Someone had laid wildflowers near the edge of each shallow grave. There was no music, no speeches, just a collective stillness. Some families wept, others sat quietly, holding hands. A few brought tokens, old toys, photographs, letters never sent. One father, now gray-haired and thin, knelt down and whispered something into the grass, his hands trembling as he clutched a rusted action figure that once belonged to his son. The grief was not new, but here, in the presence of truth, it returned with the full force of memory. All the birthdays missed, the empty beds, the questions that had no answers. Even with this discovery, the pain had not lessened. In some ways, it deepened, sharpened by the confirmation of what had been feared for so long. And yet, there was something else in the air that day. Closure, not justice. Boone, if still alive, had vanished like smoke, and there was little hope of an arrest. But closure doesn't always come with handcuffs. Sometimes, it comes in the form of knowing, of no longer wondering what if, of being able to say goodbye. In the weeks that followed, the town of Keller made a decision. The property, once considered cursed, avoided, whispered about, would be transformed into something sacred, a memorial park, not just for the children, but for the generations that had carried their absence. The town council worked with local artists, historians, and family members to design the space. A clearing was made where the barn once stood. The rubble was cleared with care, and the land was softened. 7 young cedar trees were planted in a perfect circle, each one chosen for its strength, longevity, and deep roots. One for each child. At the center of the circle, they placed a large stone plaque, etched with the names of the 7 kids and a simple phrase that brought tears to the eyes of everyone who saw it. Gone, but not forgotten. Together, forever. No flashy lights, no bronze statues, just nature, memory, and a space for quiet reflection. It didn't take long for the memorial to become a pilgrimage site. People from across Texas, and eventually the country, came to walk the small path, read the plaque, and leave tokens behind. Stuffed animals, drawings, letters, bracelets. Teachers brought classrooms there to talk about history and empathy. Families came on holidays to pray. Some came just to sit. The park became a place of healing. For the families, it was more than symbolic. It was a chance to rewrite the end of the story, not with despair, but with dignity. They could finally speak about their children in the past tense, not with doubt, but with certainty. They had been found. Their voices, long silenced, had been heard again. And in the quiet rustle of cedar branches, it was as if the children were still there, laughing, running, holding hands beneath the Texas sun. Though justice had never been officially served, no arrest, no courtroom testimony, no mugshot, the truth had finally come to light. And in that truth, there was a kind of peace. The case served as more than just a resolution to a cold file. It became a symbol, a reminder to every investigator, every journalist, every neighbor, that the answers we seek aren't always buried far away. Sometimes they're right beneath our feet. Sometimes they sit in silence for decades, waiting for someone to dig, to ask the right question, to look behind the last wall no one thought to check. It also reminded a nation of the importance of listening to the forgotten, of not letting missing children become just names on faded flyers, of not giving up, even when time tries to erase the edges of memory. Keller changed that year, not just because the children were found, but because people remembered how to care. They remembered that silence doesn't mean peace, that unresolved grief can haunt a place, a town, a family, but also that hope can endure far longer than we imagine. To this day, The memorial park remains open. The trees have grown taller. The path has become worn from thousands of feet walking in reverence. And every April 17th, candles are lit in a circle, names are read aloud, and tears are shed. Not just for the children who were lost, but for the years they were kept from being remembered properly. And maybe, just maybe, for the lives that have been saved by the lesson they left behind. Because in the end, sometimes it's not the thunder that changes everything. Sometimes it's the whisper beneath the surface, finally being heard.